Hello, and welcome to Space Madness. This is the podcast where we talk about interesting space stories and individuals with the shared experience in common of the maddening nature of space exploration. And we continue that theme today with the very special guest, Wing Commander Duncan Blake of the Royal Australian Air Force. There's a lot in that title, and I look forward to learning about it and sharing it with you all. And I think among the things we're going to talk about most is space law, a field with which I am familiar as of 10 years ago, and Wing Commander Blake is excessively familiar in the present. So some of you may know I have an LLM degree in space law. I was one of the first people to get that in the United States, but I will also be the first to admit that it is pretty stale at this point. I do read about the subject, but I would hardly call myself knowledgeable, nor do I work actively in that area now. So I'm excited for our guest and to learn more about it today. So, Duncan, please tell us about yourself. Starting with what you do.
Okay. Well, yes, I was in the military as a full-time military legal officer for 22 years. I transferred to the reserves in 2017 after 22 years. And I just have to say, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defence, the Commonwealth of Australia, or anybody else. So the reserve role is actually my part-time role. I'm actually at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, which is a university that has a close association with the Department of Defence. It actually provides tertiary education to the officer cadets and some postgraduate education, not just to military people, to any people. So, my background is very much in military law. When we talk about military law, we tend to talk about three major areas: the operations law, or, to put it very bluntly, the law about killing people and breaking things. Disciplinary law, which is like a criminal law within the military. And then administrative law, which involves issues like, you can't demote someone without good cause and have to go through natural justice processes, that sort of thing. Yeah.
So I think here in the U.S. we would call that law of war, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and administrative, something like an administrative law.
Yeah. Due process.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. I appreciate the opportunity to learn about how it works over there, compared to what little I know about how it works over here. So, is your position sort of like what we would call a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General officer over here? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Judge Advocate General sounds more impressive and interesting than legal officer. Calling us legal officers sounds a bit pedestrian, and often get the question, okay, if you're a legal officer, are you a lawyer? Well, the answer is yes. I'm also a qualified lawyer. Anybody who is a legal officer has to be a qualified lawyer.
Okay.
So yeah, and I often get the question as well. So you're a lawyer. What area do you practice?
Sure.
And I say law of war, and that's the first time people are a bit dubious. Well, actually, the first time is, the military has lawyers, and they're a bit dubious about that. And then they ask about what you do, and you talk about law of war, and they say war has law, and they're dubious about that. And then I get it a third time over because I say, I do space law, and they go,
sure,
there's law for space.
Well, my favorite story about that is that in 2008, so I started my space law LLM program in 2008, and earlier that same year there was a TV show here called Jobs You Won't Believe Exist. And space lawyer was number 17 or something like that. It was right up there with chainsaw juggler and underwater basket weaver. But it is interesting to see the world kind of catch up to this subject as to a once obscure subject that is now, we've seen some very real applications. I mean, even back then, was it '08? Was, I think, one of the first, it was, I think, a Chinese launch that created a bunch of space debris. Was that '08? So
2007, actually. Yeah.
Seven. Okay, so I remember thinking, okay, well, this is going to be important. I mean, it is important, but it's going to be more. It's going to be less obscure,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's happened. So, oh, sorry. So this is our co-host. She hears me talk, and
Hello. Yeah,
she.
you probably can't see. There's a little
Oh,
dog.
very nice.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, yeah. So
Right.
I once tried to keep her off of me, but when I talk, I think she feels the vibration, and
Right.
Anyway, so
So,
let's go back a few steps. How did you end up? What was your path to the military, and how did you end up in this relatively once obscure area
yeah,
of
well, I
space
was much
law?
more interested in the law actually, and my relationship with the law has gone through a number of periods, if you like. The early period was a sort of romance, in a sense, inspired by To Kill a Mockingbird, and
Really?
people would know that, and the lawyer in that story, Atticus Finch, really sort of sparked my interest in the idea of justice and that everyone should be equal before the law, which was famously not the case in To Kill a Mockingbird. And so I was always interested in the law, and the question was, in what context would I practice law? And I thought about the different areas of practicing law, and thought, well, so I started doing law at university, and speaking to my colleagues and my fellow students about what they wanted to do. Most of them wanted to go into corporate law firms, and I thought, well, I'm not sure that I want to spend several months on some question about how to make a corporation or CEOs or directors get richer, or something like that. That's not really what appeals to me. And it was towards the end of school, so I finished school in 1990, was the first Gulf War. And there were, missiles flying through streets, and issues of something called rules of engagement. I'd never heard of rules of engagement before, and was fascinated by this idea of rules of engagement, which are sort of internal directives which delimit the circumstances in which force can be used. And then we also had war in the former Yugoslavia, and there were very interesting, very unfortunate events like in Srebrenica, and the Dutch battalion, and the failure to do anything to save the population from what was happening, apparently on the basis that their rules of engagement didn't allow them to take action. So I thought that was really fascinating, and I continued to pursue that.
All right, and we're back. We had a rapid unscheduled disconnection. Just the cost of doing business between Georgia and Australia. So when last we heard from Mr. Blake, we were talking about influential global events in his youth that moved him to focus on military law. So I believe you're talking about the first Gulf War and Bosnia.
Yes, yeah. So in the former Yugoslavia, and the massacre in Srebrenica, which there was a Dutch battalion there, and the Dutch battalion didn't intervene to prevent the massacre, and apparently on the basis that their rules of engagement did not permit them to do so. And so that was very unfortunate, but also fascinating to me. And again, I was very interested in this idea of rules of engagement. And Australia at that time had something called the undergraduate scheme, where you get paid to study by the Department of Defence. You had to choose to join a particular service, and do an interview, etc. And I found out about this. As it happens, my uncle was the Chief of Defence Force at the time, and so I wouldn't have known about it unless he told me about that. And I'll just mention that because it becomes relevant later in my career, in respect of Iraq 2003. So yeah, those were influential moments in my decision to want to do military law, and you know, and part of it was financial as well. It's a great opportunity. It's a really, excuse me, really interesting area of law to work in. And it wasn't until probably 2007 that I really started to focus on space law. But I guess we'll
Okay.
get to that. Yeah.
Yeah, same for me. I mean, I started law school in 2005. I in retrospect, I never wanted to be a practicing attorney, but I was really interested in the law as a system that humans created, as opposed to natural systems, biological systems, computer systems. Of course, we created those, but the idea of a legal system that really controls our lives certainly has the ability to end our lives under certain
Yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting thing, and coming from a computer background, growing up with the internet, you know, interested in these kind of systems above us that touch
Yeah.
us every day. That was one of the things that drove me. But I remember I was in a civil procedure class first year, and I asked about space objects and the rockets and crashes, and everyone looked at me, you know, like I had three heads. And the professor said, "Well, I don't know, but let's talk afterwards." And it became very clear to me just how obscure it was, at least at the time, 20 years ago now. Wow, 20 years ago, in a classroom. So around the same time we got interested. But I want to go back to the book that inspired you so much. You know,
Yeah.
here I think most of my listeners will consider that an American book, or a book about American history or a period of it. So I'm really curious how you even came upon it, and how it related to your experience of growing up in Australia, which I don't know anything about
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah, well, there's certainly racism in Australia and has been for a long time, and I can't remember how many years ago it was. There was a referendum, so not just a normal electoral vote, but a referendum to change the constitution. And you know, as in any country, referendums of that nature are pretty rare. It was a referendum about giving the First Nations people of Australia a explicit or a specific voice in Parliament. And unfortunately, that didn't get up. And I think that is really unfortunate, because we could, you know, those of us who are not from a First Nations background, who don't have this continuing connection with country, could learn a lot from those who have maintained a continuing connection with country, and that becomes relevant in respect of space law, and among other things, space resource exploitation, and the
Okay.
approach that we take to that as well.
Well, I look forward to getting into that. Isn't the First Nations, isn't that history the longest continuous history in human history period? So I read something like 25,000 years.
Yeah, it's a lot more than that. So, estimates somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 years in Australia. The world's first astronomer.
Wow.
So, just as you've got
Oh.
Stonehenge, and a lot of people know about Stonehenge in the UK, there's a much older site in Australia where the stones are, you know, not as well cut, but they're shaped for astronomical purposes
Okay.
to align with the stars. And they've been, you know, one of the difficulty that they've always had is their tradition, that their histories are oral histories rather than written histories. And so, you know, somebody from a Western sort of culture coming to Australia and thinking these people, you know, are not cultured because they don't have the histories or whatever.
Sure.
Like they did. It was just oral history, not written history. Yeah, so really interesting. It was unfortunate that we don't have the voice. It's been controversial in Australia. We have a sort of tradition that not everyone embraces, but a welcome to country. So welcome to country and also acknowledgement of country. So, I really probably should have started with
Uh,
acknowledging that I am currently on Ngunnawal land, which is not to
oh,
say that the Ngunnawal people own this land, but they have a connection with this land. And in any environmental context, that's pretty important to understand the ongoing connection that they have.
well, I appreciate that, and it's wonderful to hear. Well, it's very interesting to hear these parallels between the United States and Australia regarding the people that were here before these nations. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is part two of the podcast with Mr. Duncan Blake from the Royal Australian Air Force. Obviously, we have had a wardrobe change because some connection issues last night prevented us from finishing the episode. But we're back, and we'll pick up right where we left off, which was roughly around the 2007-2008 era, uh, where both of us, coincidentally, were developing a keen interest in space law. And so I'll hand it right back to you. What was the event that really put your sights in that direction? And I'm curious how your peers and colleagues at the time in the military law world, how they responded, and was that a logical progression? Yeah. See, I figured there's a story there. So
Yeah.
take it away, please.
Yeah, yeah. So 2007 was when the Chinese tested an anti-satellite missile against a weather satellite. It was also when I was doing staff college, which is kind of like a military version of doing an MBA. So whilst I was doing staff college, they encourage you to extend yourself. So I was assigned when we did exercises, activity scenarios, to thinking about space-derived ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which was pretty cool. I was pretty happy with that from my perspective, but it was somewhat unfamiliar to me as somebody who had spent, the past, whatever it was at that stage, 15 years focused on military law. So yeah, and in the relationship between the United States and Australia, the United States pointed out, I think, to the Australian Defence Force, well, look, you rely pretty heavily on space infrastructure provided by the United States, which is still the case. We rely pretty heavily, but the threats and issues are mounting, and we need you to step up. And I was in the right place at the right time. I went out from staff college to something called the Directorate of Operations and International Law, or DOIL for short. And Doyle does strategic legal support at the strategic level to the whole department and to the Australian government. And so I was assigned space issues, space and legal issues, which was awesome. And at the same time, Australia was in Australia's history, and I should probably, describe a little bit of this. So there's a area near Adelaide, right kind of in the middle of Australia, called Woomera. Very big open plain, and dry place, not much there. Although there has been sort of traditional use of the by the First Nations people for there for some time. But it was the site of the establishment of a long-range weapons research establishment by Australia, the US, and the UK collaboratively, and even the predecessor to the European Space Agency, so ELDO, the the European Launch and Development Organisation, was involved there. So everyone was researching quite a lot in Woomera, South Australia, and launching things. So UK's first rocket was launched from there, and they
Oh,
proudly say that they beat us to it to launching a rocket, but it was from Australia. Depending on how you look at things, I won't get too far into the debate. The Australia was the third nation to launch a satellite, but it didn't do so on its own rocket. It did so from Woomera, but
okay.
US operations in Woomera were winding down, and they had a spare rocket. And so they said, well,
Ah,
if you Aussies want to launch something, you can. And so our scientists very quickly put something together. It was called RESAT, Weapons Research Establishment Satellite, and sent it into space. And just for your interest, Woomera is the word. I think it's of the Darug people around Sydney, which is a bit out of place, but it refers to the thing that you attach to a spear to increase the range of the spear. So it's a sort of long range weapon thing.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
The
So
the sling, kind of a
yeah,
sling to extend the lever of
yeah,
throwing it, basically. Okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
and of course, I'm sure we'll get to the Woomera manual and that whole
Yes,
process. Okay,
yes.
I see. So very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So then when the US left, the UK left. It was a very sort of unfortunate phase where the Australian government said, "Well, we're looking at all the money that's being poured into space, and we're not prepared to spend all of that money. We have this relationship with the US. Why would we spend any more money on space when we can, just get what we want from the US?" And that continued for some time, and politicians in South Australia were trying for decades to reinvigorate the industry. So around 2008, 2009, the South Australian politicians had some success and had a research grant scheme, and I tried to leverage that research grant scheme to
Ah,
create the impetus for a series of legalisses to go to overseas to do a master's in space law. And at the time, I was looking for where to do. I didn't succeed, but they sort of recognised the need and said, "Oh, we're going to send you anyway," which was awesome. And
okay.
then I was looking for where to go, and on my list was University of
Oh,
Nebraska.
really?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. McGill University and Leiden University.
Sure.
But at that time, the University of Nebraska, the space law program was very nascent.
Yes, and that was me, and that's where I was, and where my career really started.
Yeah,
Just for fun, it's wonderful. We could have met then,
yeah,
and the moment that I knew that was in my future was early in 2008, when the economy was collapsing in the U.S. All the legal jobs were the low end ones were disappearing, and the mid career people were desperate to keep them. And so, and I one day opened the Wall Street Journal on the subway, and I saw this little tiny article that said Nebraska creating space law program.
right.
And I'll never forget it, because I just kind of sat up and looked at it again and stared out the window, and I said, well, okay. And
Yeah,
I was about to get married, and that was in mid 2008. So I went home and I said to my girlfriend, that now wife, I said, "Hey, how do you feel about Nebraska?" And obviously, she had never put any thought into it, nor had I, other than flying over it repeatedly. But that's where it took me. So
yeah,
interesting to see that parallel. So you ended up
yes,
in Canada.
yeah, yeah. I have to admit, I had a similar conversation with my family, but sort of asking them about the pros and cons of
Sure.
living in Nebraska versus Montreal, and Montreal
Yeah.
was down winter there.
Fair
So
enough.
yeah,
Yeah.
I ended up going to McGill University, and I did my master's thesis on the need. I actually called it the need for a manual of international law applicable to warfare in space,
Okay.
which would have made the cool acronym MIL-LAWS. And so my supervisor, Ram Jaku, you may be familiar with that name. Ram Jaku thought, this sounded like a great idea, and we went out looking for funding for a group to come together to create the manual. And I have to say that the idea is not as original as it might seem, because there had been the Tallinn manual on cyber warfare, the Harvard manual on air and missile warfare, the San Remo manual on armed conflict at sea.
Well, that was going to be my next question: is there a history of these? So, and was it similar? Was it similar global events that motivated those processes as well? I can imagine a cyber manual did not make a lot of sense until the 90s, perhaps.
Right.
Okay.
So, I mean, the first was, probably the first, I think, was around 1908. And I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but the idea was, in the absence of nations coming together to write new treaties, there's value in a group of experts coming together and consolidating knowledge on the application of laws of armed conflict to particular domains, and this relates to kind of a little bit of an issue that is still playing out today. So, and it's to do with military cultures. So in the East, they tend to be very centralised, very prescriptive military cultures, as in the hierarchy says, this is what you'll do and this is how you do it, quite precisely. In the West, we have a culture of what we call mission command. So, the commander gives you a mission and parameters and expects you to exercise initiative and discretion in carrying that out. So in the West, when it comes to how should armed conflict be regulated, in the West, the preference is for conduct-based regulation. Whereas in the East, it's let's prescribe certain means and methods of warfare. So you can use these weapons, you can't use those weapons, you can't use these particular methods or whatever. Whereas in the West, it's more conduct based, as in when you're attacking someone, you have to abide by the principle of distinction. And so when it came to nations coming together to try and agree on the law of armed conflict, in respect of land warfare, it was relatively easy to come to consensus. But when it came to applying law of armed conflict to, new pieces of kit, emerging modes of warfare, new technology platforms, etc., it was really hard to achieve consensus because, strategically, one thing a state never wants is to narrow its flexibility of options available.
Well, I'd also imagine it's a tall order to ask for the kinds of disclosure of capabilities that would be necessary for a meaningful agreement, right? Because and when every country is competing not just for ground and territory, but internally for its own technological development, how do you even come to the table without giving away half your your secrets?
Yeah. So, humanitarians from the mid-19th century were trying very hard to develop consensus.
Really? Okay.
There was Franz Lieber in the US, and the Lieber Code, which is the genesis of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and also the genesis of a lot of law of armed conflict. And a guy
Huh.
called Henri Dunant, who is the founder of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And
Wow.
so for several decades, people, they and people like them were trying to bring nations together to develop the law of armed conflict. And they were frustrated that, they could get consensus on some basic rules in respect of land warfare, but when it came to armed conflict at sea, in the air, and elsewhere, it was hard to get consensus. And so the first effort for something that didn't necessarily involve states was, I think, around 1908, the Oxford Manual to do with naval warfare.
Wow.
And that was a group of experts, and they kind of repeated that in 1994. So San Remo Manual is 1994. That then inspired the Harvard Manual in
If
2007, I think it
if we
was.
could pause at the naval manual, I would imagine there are things like don't shoot the men in the water. There's
Right.
some kind of obligation to rescue the enemy combatant if he's totally disabled from. Okay, so then that takes me in my mind right to the rescue convention or the rescue agreement in
Right.
space. So, okay, see, I didn't know. So this is very interesting background that I either wasn't there or I missed in my space law class. So very interesting to see
Yeah.
how much of a historical precedent there was, and not just the historical precedent, but back before the League of Nations even,
Yeah.
let alone the UN or the other organizations. So very interesting. I'm going to have to go read up on those myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Some interesting parallels, or not parallels, interesting origin of parts of the Outer Space Treaty from the Antarctic Treaty, if you've ever noticed that. So Article 1 of the Antarctic Treaty is very, very similar, not the same, importantly, it's not the same as Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. We can come back to that. But yeah, so the Harvard Manual 2007 Air and Missile Warfare, the Tallinn Manual, the first one was 2011, and and that was
Okay.
about when I sort of said we need a manual for space, and was trying to get funding for it, and approached a
Uh-huh.
lady philanthropist by the name Cinder Arsenault. And if you've heard of the Secure World
Uh,
Foundation and wondered where
oh,
they get their money,
yes.
yeah, Cinder
Okay,
Arsenault.
I did know about them. I did know about that organization and their funding, but I didn't know that it also connected to the manual. I'm curious if we could pause in the past a little bit. What
Yeah,
was the obvious question is that the naval manual from 1908, I forget the name, but that was in effect, or at
yeah,
least that predated the World War One and World War Two. I mean,
right.
were those must have been interesting cases, interesting periods for something like that to be tested. I'm
Yeah,
curious if it, were they effective in what was the international response to
yeah.
to those manuals and those conflicts.
I mean, I haven't looked into it in deep detail, but I would think it was partially effective in clarifying the law applicable to naval warfare. And there's, quite often, as an international lawyer, you have cynics come to us and say, well, look at all these incidents or instances of non-compliance. And that's true. There are instances of non-compliance, but it's a bit like, just to confuse you and your listeners, people driving on the right side of the road
Sure,
versus the left side of the
sure,
road.
sure.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah,
you go out on the road, and 99.9999% of the time, people are driving on the left side of the road. The fact that there might sometimes be someone
sure.
driving on the wrong side of the road does not undermine the law
Yeah.
itself, ultimately.
Yeah, I can imagine even going back to the Code of Hammurabi, there were probably people saying, "What is this? What is this? Why'd you waste a perfectly good tablet on this nonsense?" And
Right.
of course, it's the whole global foundation for the idea of the rule of law. So I like that. I'm going to use that myself. I like that.
Right.
And for the listener, the whole international world, the best way the way I kind of frame the international legal system for myself is it came, and for the listeners is that it came out of a system of norms of behavior that eventually became expectations, even if there aren't ironclad enforcement mechanisms. And I'm sure that's oversimplified, but that's how I picture it. And I imagine the specifics are highly situation dependent and depend on the parties and all of that.
Right.
In general, that's the distinction in international law and the kinds of law that most people deal with every day, whether they know it or not. So,
Yeah.
so they sent you off to do space law.
Yeah.
You found a way, and you said,
Yeah.
"Hey, there's a real need for this." And were they happy to hear that, how was that perceived? How was your idea for the manual? How was that perceived when you got back or along the way? And
Yeah.
what was I could imagine a wide variety of reactions, everything from,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, that we needed that 20 years ago," to, "What are you talking about? We barely even have a cyber manual. What do we need a space manual for?"
Yeah. Yeah. So, it wasn't hard to gather experts to come together to want to contribute to this. It was hard to find the funding. And I just, finish the story a little bit in respect of Cinder Arsenault. So
Ah,
when we approached her, she said, "Can you give me, is there something similar that already exists?" And I said, "Well, yeah, actually there is. Have a look at the Tallinn manual." And I showed it to her, and she had a flick through that, and she said, "Okay, well, I get it. I get how this could be a good thing for the space community, but I'm a philanthropist, and you're asking me to put my name to something that has warfare and space in the title. I'm a little uncomfortable with that." So I thought about it a little bit and came up with Manual of International Law applicable to military uses of outer space, or
okay,
MILIMOS. And
okay,
MILIMOS is what the McGill Manual is becoming. So, and I should just say, originally it was one project. It split into two projects. That inevitably leads to a question about why it split. There's a lot involved, but I would say that you're bringing together different areas, different legal specializations, people who have specialized on space law for a couple of decades, with its heritage of peaceful uses of outer space and of it being the province of all humanity, to use gender neutral terms as opposed to what's actually in the space treaty.
sure,
And then you have military lawyers and LOAC practitioners and law of war experts. And this group of people, the latter, had quite a lot of experience with these manuals, had been involved in these manuals and hit the ground running. So when we had to put together the manual, they absolutely hit the ground running and were very quick in developing draft rules. For, I think, the space law community, this was a necessary but confronting project, and trying to think about how law of war applies in space was challenging, and so they were pretty it was pretty difficult to make progress. And essentially, a decision was made that, look, how about we focus on, law of armed conflict, law of war, and to some extent on the space law as the foundations. And they focused on military uses of outer space in peacetime, which is why we
ah,
ended up with a McGill manual and a Woomera manual.
okay,
Yeah,
okay, interesting.
yeah,
So in all of this discussion, we haven't mentioned the U.S.
right.
So now I'm really curious. We've had three or four presidents since then, with very different perspectives on executive power and the role of the United States military. When something like this happens without the U.S. being involved in the beginning, how do you bring it up? How is this introduced to the gigantic behemoth that is the U.S. military, maybe,
Right.
or the State Department, what have you? How did that, how and to what extent, you know, did the United States begin to interact?
Yeah. So when you're doing one of these manuals, you have to kind of decide in terms of getting experts involved whether you go for a representative group of experts from around the world for the purposes of being representative, or whether you focus on the most expert people in the field. And the Woomera
Okay.
manual decided to focus on, the most expert people in the field, the people who had written most on this, and predominantly that was from the West. Not only from the West, there, we had someone
Okay.
from China, we had someone from Russia involved at one point in
Okay.
time, but mostly from the West. So the experts, we had experts from the United States Air Force, and from the UK, from Australia, from Canada, from a bunch of other countries as well. So the US Department of Defence was pretty keen to be
Okay.
involved. The same with the Australian Defence Force, pretty keen to be involved, but it had to be clear from both parties that this was not an endorsement of the outcome of the research.
Okay.
From the perspective of the states, they don't want to endorse something that they haven't controlled.
Sure.
And from the perspective of others who are developing this particular manual, we don't want their endorsement, because if they endorse it, then it undermines the perception of universality of the manual.
Ah, I
Right.
see. So
Yeah.
because it's because it is sort of, it seems like it sort of straddles a line between a let's say a contract, and but it's actually contemplating a conflict situation where the U.S. may be a part of it, and so I can see where I can see why full endorsement might be counterproductive,
Yeah.
because that almost presumes that it will not be party to a future conflict where it's relevant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, interesting. And
Yeah.
this is making me think about how these agreements, it's sort of like having a legal system as the alternative to beating up your neighbor every time a tree falls over, right?
Right.
Having an alternative to doing that. This is sort of like the next version at the global scale, which is getting ahead of inevitable future conflicts and saying, okay, we all realize that physical destruction is an undesirable outcome, but we also realize there's going to be conflicts and debates. So what can we do to get ahead of it? So I like it's a
Yeah.
really interesting historical series of agreements, that you really needed a post globalized world, to recognize the need and to participate. I mean, I'm thinking of well, I read an article, I don't know if it's true, that Iran had basically said to the DoD, you can bomb this thing, and fine, we'll let it happen, and vice versa. And so it's the face. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying I can imagine these things occur to save face, but also to project strength.
Yes.
And I imagine, I'll never know this for a fact. I've never had a clearance,
Mm.
but I imagine those things are arranged at some times to minimize the larger, to minimize a larger conflict by allowing both or multiple sides to throw some rocks and make the people feel. I don't want to speculate too wildly, but
Right.
It recognizes the fact that, well, even after we fight our neighbors, they're still our neighbors, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, yeah, well, exactly. And, it's frustrating many people, the people who make decisions about whether to go to war, etc., are experts in making war. But really, what we need is experts in making peace. Because, to go way back and draw on a little bit of ancient history, the philosophy of war and why it exists. I think it was Aristotle who says we make war in order that we may live at peace. And it's a really interesting concept because quite often people think of war and peace as diametric opposites,
Yeah.
whereas they're not. I mean, the Ukraine is involved in a war, and not because they want that war, but because they want a better peace. They don't want a peace that involves Russia occupying a lot of its nation, right? Russia would say they also want a better peace, but the way they define the better peace is not something that any of us agree with. So we make war in order that we may live at peace, and they're not binary opposites. In fact, in the course that I do, called Space Cooperation, Competition and Conflict, recognises a new paradigm in military thinking, which doesn't use the binary peace-war dichotomy, but instead thinks of the situation as the competition spectrum. So you have, states are always in competition. Sometimes there's cooperation, quite a lot of the time there's cooperation, and sometimes there's conflict. And what you have to do is to manage the competition and hopefully verge towards cooperation wherever possible. So, ultimately it would be better if we had more people who were experts in making peace and less experts in making war, because at the end of the day, as you say, you still have to live together, right?
Yeah, and there's something very philosophically satisfying about that, I think. Well, one thing I've always thought is that in the modern world, and again, total speculation, it seems to me that for every bullet that's actually fired, there's got to be 1,000 cyber actions, and that in an ancient world of spears and swords, there's no alternative.
Right.
There's no way to exert force to project strength without actually doing something. But in the modern world, it seems to me that there's constant saber rattling, physical sabers. There's constant cyber rattling.
Yeah.
Oh, I really like how that turn of phrase, saber and
Yeah.
cyber rattling. I'll leave that. I'll leave it at
Should.
that.
You
But
should.
but
Yeah.
I feel like this is constantly happening, and by the time something actually reaches a level of atoms being fired at each other as opposed to
Yeah.
electrons, there's a, like you said, there's a continuum
Yeah.
that hopefully doesn't rise above. Any loss of life is tragic, but that hopefully doesn't rise above a skirmish or something small scale,
Right. Right.
and
Yeah.
and that maybe it's naive to hope for a world without war, but that we can perhaps hope for a world of contained, small
Yep.
small stakes, and allow the warring parties to. And I don't know how naive this sounds, but allow the warring parties to project the strength that they want to project.
Right.
Their populations feel sufficiently defended, and maybe a minimization of actual damage. I read this fascinating paper about war in space, and I'm curious how you respond as a professional in this area. It basically made the argument that a physical confrontation between two space objects might not actually be all that bad for the following reasons. One, it's expensive enough that it's going to be less common. Two, it's far enough away, nobody's going to see it, so it's not going to inflame a population of millions with bloodlust. And it allows the kind of exchange of and testing of capabilities and strength far away from a population, because there's nobody out there. So, and I don't know I don't know how. I don't know
Yeah.
how you. I mean, I'm curious how you think about that. It struck me as a really interesting perspective on that domain.
Yeah, so a couple of reactions to that. I would say that, if warfare in inverted commas, there's terminological definitions there, but I won't get into it. But if
Sure.
warfare occurs in cyberspace, then that's better than a whole lot of people getting killed or injured, houses destroyed, infrastructure destroyed, and so on. But on the other hand, this idea that that there could be a lower threshold and we're less concerned, and the expression that sometimes is used is satellites have no mothers, is the thinking that could lead to the Russians detonating a nuclear weapon in outer space. So, I think in February last year, in Congress there was release of some intelligence that the Russians are developing a nuclear weapon for outer space. Now that would be a direct violation of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty if they did that. But when Putin and the Russians are thinking about, well, how do we escalate without escalating too far? The answer may be, detonating a nuclear weapon in outer space. For all of the sorts of reasons that you said, you're not going to kill anyone directly. You're not necessarily going to see it. So probably if Russia does that, the US is not going to feel the need to a nuclear strike on Russia itself. But it is a pretty huge escalation, and it would mean probably that a whole orbital shell is not usable for probably decades. So yeah, that's quite a big concern. There's another sort of issue here as well. So if you're a military person and you don't get to cite Clausewitz at some point in time, you're not trying hard enough. So Clausewitz describes war as an act of violence to compel the enemy to do your will. And two things to note about that. One is ultimately war is a cognitive thing. It's changing the mind of your enemy. And two, war inherently involves some violence. And that's relevant to the threshold at which law of armed conflict applies, which is a pretty important threshold, because the moment that law of armed conflict applies, you're kind of putting aside normal law. So under normal law, killing people is murder. But you set that aside and you say law of armed conflict now applies, and you can kill people for what is essentially a fashion crime in a sense. They're wearing the wrong uniform. I don't like your uniform. I'm going to kill you. And you don't need any judicial process for that.
Yeah.
So it's pretty important where that threshold lies. And the reason I say that is because the danger in calling cyber activity warfare is that you thereby say, okay, we're in a war, law of armed conflict applies, we can kill whoever we like. Whereas, in fact, the activity may have only been in cyberspace. So, there's some danger in lowering that threshold.
I see. Yes. So the counter to what I read is we actually want the threshold to be higher, even if the consequences are lower on the population, because it shifts the whole window away from peaceful resolution. Okay, I see.
Right.
Interesting. Certainly, similar philosophical questions as the ancients wrestled with, perhaps.
Yeah.
Just different toys,
Yeah.
different tools.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So we're getting into the mid 2010s. It sounds like you currently teach a course
Yeah.
or at least one. Can you tell me how you transitioned from sort of the consensus builder to the professor? And
Right.
does that bring us up to the present day, more or less?
Yeah, more or
Okay.
less. So as kind of the founder of Millimos and the Woomera manual, and like I say, originally it was one project. Became apparent to me that I could not be centrally involved in this project. It was a thrill to be centrally involved in the project while being a full-time military member.
Okay.
Not just because of the time it would take a lot of time, but also because it would, undermine the independence of the manual and
Mm.
constantly raise questions about conflict of interest for me. So I made the decision to transition from the military to the reserves,
Okay.
and I immediately started doing a PhD because the work that I would be doing on the
Mm.
manual was kind of similar to writing a PhD. But I
Okay.
was also thinking, well, I'd like to work in the space industry and do space law, and started sort of meeting and greeting and networking and all that sort of thing.
Mm.
And interestingly, when people, young lawyers in particular, heard that I'm a space lawyer, they're like, "Wow, I would love to get
Mm.
into space
Mm.
law." And they asked me, "Well, how do I get into space law?" And to which I had to answer, "Well, there's not a lot of opportunities at the moment. Give us 5, 10 years,
Yeah.
and maybe there'll be a lot of opportunities. But really, if you want to do space law, then spend 20 years in the military, and then you might get to do space law,
Sure.
or work in our equivalent of the Federal Communications Commission.
Mm. Mm.
There's a couple of people who did it there.
Sure.
That was pretty much it.
Sure.
And there were some big law firms who touched on
Okay.
telecommunications. Yeah.
I'll actually add for the viewers, the way I was taught space law, it was broken up into sort of a couple of categories: international and domestic. And here in the U.S., we have quite a bit of domestic space law that most people don't know about.
Mm.
Insurance obligations, launch regulations, more and more now than when I was studying it. But it's not quite as obscure as it once was, and it starts to become almost reasonable because, well, you have a law about the emissions of your delivery truck,
Mm.
engaged in the commerce of delivering things and consuming fuel and producing exhaust and stuff like that. Well, we are in a world where there are enough commercial space activities that a regulatory framework is totally reasonable, like in any other business. So I would just add that for the viewer, and
Yeah.
obviously anyone listening is interested in space law, reach out. Happy to talk about it. It was a very interesting field to study, as sort of my terminal degree, at least so far, and it got me where I wanted to go, into NASA. So, so you teach this. So how many courses do you teach right now?
Two courses. I'm just about to
Okay.
launch into the second semester course, which is
Okay.
for undergraduates, which are in at University of New South Wales in Canberra.
Mm.
99.5% or something like that, officer cadets, uniform people.
Ah.
There are a small handful of civilians at the undergraduate
Mm.
level. But the course I do is called Law, Force and Legitimacy. And the
Hmm.
premise essentially is that, the for anybody going into the Defence Force
Mm.
nowadays, they have to understand that the maintenance of legitimacy and the battle for legitimacy is not just a problem for the legal officer or JAG, to use the US term.
Mm.
Everybody
Mm.
needs to understand the problem of legitimacy. And to give you a really good example,
Mm.
Ukraine would not be as successful as they have been in resisting the Russian invasion
Mm.
if they didn't have legitimacy. If they wouldn't
Okay.
be able to get the arms from Europe, from the US, from Australia, from
Ah.
elsewhere, if they didn't maintain legitimacy. You can
Okay.
imagine the moment that there's lots of stories, media stories about Ukrainian war crimes, that would be
Uh-huh.
the end of arms
I
deals,
see.
right?
I
So
see.
pretty
I
important.
imagine those thresholds are also constantly in flux as everyone involved pushes limits and uncontrollable events
Yeah.
cause reactions. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and
You know,
Russia
I
absolutely understands that a key to the success of Ukraine is legitimacy, and so
okay.
some of their information warfare is
Mhm.
trying to undermine the legitimacy of Ukraine at every
Oh,
opportunity.
I'd
Yeah,
imagine I'd imagine if you get baited into doing something that cost you your legitimacy, well, too bad, and you lost it. Then it's
right,
on. I imagine. Okay, so I imagine it's on. It's a responsibility of every party to maintain that and exert that control over themselves, regardless of.
right,
Okay,
right,
interesting.
right.
I'd be very interested in the reading list for your course. I mean, this is
Yeah,
really something. I really like it.
yeah,
Interesting. Well, anyone listening at University of New South Wales, you should sign up. This sounds like a really interesting history course. Also, that was one of my favorite things about the law school was the history involved. In fact, I think I like that more than the law to some degree because it's sort of like the first principles in engineering and physics. You understand the things that happened in human history and the way humans reacted, and suddenly the rules we have make a little bit more sense.
yeah.
Sometimes, not always, sometimes. So I think that we're going to call it today for now. I would very much like to do another call with you at some point and talk
Sure.
about commercial space law.
Mm,
But I think this is going to do it, and I'll put these two parts together somehow. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening. I really mean it. If you get me that reading list, I'll put it in the show notes. I'm
yeah,
sure some people will want to read a few things on these things. I'm going to go look up those manuals and
mm,
start cause for the historical context. I got family that was in the Navy in World War II, and it's fascinating to me to think that the U.S. Navy to think that this manual was could have kept them alive, or that
yeah,
may have played a part, and so on. So
yeah.
with that, thank you so much for joining and for your patience with the connections. And
Sure.
I'm sure we'll talk again and again.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks so
Great.
much. Talk
Thank you
soon.
for a very interesting discussion.
Likewise.
Yeah.